Imagine this, a global system where one country consistently gets a free lunch, able to run massive deficits, pile up debt, and basically have other nations pick up the tab. How could that even work?
It sounds, well, almost impossible, doesn't it? Too good to be true. But what if, according to one, let's say, controversial economist, this isn't fiction at all?
And that's exactly what we're getting into today. Michael Hudson's super imperialism.
Right. It's his critical look at how the United States built and kept its global economic dominance, especially after 1971, when the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. That really changed the game.
Yeah, a fundamental shift. So Hudson's book, first out over 30 years ago, argues the U.S. created this, new kind of empire, not by grabbing land, but through the global money system and using institutions like the IMF and the World Bank.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack Hudson's main arguments. We'll trace the history, starting way back after World War I, following U.S. economic moves right up to the early 2000s.
And we want to understand the mechanics he describes, some deliberate, some maybe just opportunities they seized, how the U.S. ended up in this unique position of financial power.
Get ready for some, well, possibly surprising ideas, maybe a few aha moments about how global finance actually works. Because, Hudson definitely challenges this standard narrative.
Okay, let's do it. So let's rewind. Hudson says this whole thing starts taking shape right after World War I. The U.S. comes out as the world's main creditor, lots of financial muscle.
Right. Europe was devastated. You'd think the U.S. might be, understanding about the war debts, given the huge human cost and property damage over there.
You would think. But Hudson points out something pretty startling.
Yeah, the U.S. government insisted on getting paid back in full from its European allies, kind of ignoring the devastation. And apparently, during the war, U.S. officials had even hinted the loans might be treated more like gifts.
But that's not what happened. They took a really hard line.
A very hard line. Hudson notes, the U.S. was telling its allies, be moderate with German reparations, but then turned around and was totally immoderate, demanding repayment from those same allies.
Wow. So that's where the nickname Uncle Shylock came from.
That's what they call the U.S. in Europe. It really showed America's priorities back then.
What were those priorities exactly, and how did that set the stage?
Well, it was this weird paradox. In the 1920s, the U.S. government was laser-focused on its own Treasury's balance sheet. Getting repaid was paramount, more important, apparently, than global financial stability or cooperation.
So it wasn't about helping the world economy get back on its feet?
Not primarily, no. Hudson argues this hard line basically forced other countries away from internationalism. They couldn't balance their books globally if the U.S. wasn't playing ball, so they turned inward towards national self-sufficiency.
And this tension, domestic versus international, it really blew up later, didn't it, at the London Economic Conference in 1933?
Oh, absolutely. Europe was desperate. They needed currency stability, debt relief, linked to German reparations. They were looking for a global fix.
But FDR had just come into office.
Right. And President Roosevelt had, other plans. His number one focus was the U.S. domestic economy, getting prices back up for American farmers and debtors. He actually cut the dollar loose from gold right before the conference started.
To try and inflate prices at home.
Exactly. And then came the bombshell. He just flat out rejected international currency stabilization at the conference. The British were pleading for it, saying it was essential, but nope.
American recovery first, global stability second. Or maybe not even second.
Pretty much. And the fallout was huge.
Yeah.
With international cooperation dead in the water, European countries felt they had no choice but to go protectionist.
Yeah.
Nationalistic, autarkic, they called it, trying to be self-sufficient, creating their own economic blocks.
And Hudson, among others, suggests this didn't exactly help prevent World War II.
He argues it directly contributed. The economic rivalries, the tensions. It was a really stark early example of the U.S. putting its domestic needs way ahead of global financial health, with, disastrous consequences down the line.
Okay, so fast forward through another world war. The U.S. emerges even stronger, unquestionably the top dog economically.
Yeah.
Now they need foreign markets, right? To keep the U.S. economy humming, keep people employed.
Yes, that realization was key. And it led to a big shift in strategy compared to after World War I.
How so?
Well, this time the U.S. saw an open international economy as a good thing, as long as it was structured correctly. The idea was to link other countries into what Hudson calls a satellite relationship. Their economy is basically orbiting the U.S. economy.
Dependent on it.
Dependent, yes. So they weren't afraid of multilateralism anymore. They embraced it, provided it served U.S. interests.
Which brings us to Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank. The U.S. championed these, but made sure it stayed in charge.
Absolutely. They built in mechanisms for control. The
Right.
big one was the voting structure.
How did that work?
So they pushed for this 80% majority needed for major decisions in both the IMF and World Bank. But the U.S. held like 27 to 33% of the votes.
Giving them a veto.
Exactly. A unilateral veto. Plus, they insisted the institutions be based in the U.S., which tilted them towards a creditor perspective. Keynes, the famous British economist, he wasn't thrilled. He basically said the Americans thought because they were the biggest, they could call all the shots.
Okay, so the World Bank. It had development in its name, but Hudson argues its actual lending practices created something else. Dependency.
That's his argument, yes. He says the bank pushed U.S. agricultural exports, often by discouraging things like land reform or farming self-sufficiency in other countries.
So countries might get loans for industry, but not necessarily to modernize their farms.
Right. Leading to industrial growth, maybe, but without the strong agricultural base needed to support it long term, making them reliant on U.S. food imports. It fostered a kind of structural imbalance, a dependency.
And then layer on top of this the Cold War.
Right. That provided a whole new rationale for foreign aid. What might have started as humanitarian relief increasingly became about national security, fighting communism.
So aid got militarized.
Significantly. By 1969, over half, 52% of U.S. aid was actually military aid, just called security assistance. Hudson argues this loaded recipient nations down with socially destructive military overheads. Heavy defense spending, they maybe couldn't afford.
Wow, even food aid.
Even the Food for Peace program, PL 480. Apparently, it ended up helping foreign countries finance military buys, essentially turning surplus U.S. crops into a way to fund arms deals abroad.
Okay, this is leading us towards a really crucial turning point. What Hudson sees as cementing America's free lunch, the Treasury bill standard.
Yes. So, starting around the Korean War, the U.S. was consistently running a balance of payments deficit, mostly because of huge overseas military spending, like in Vietnam.
Which normally sounds like a bad thing, right?
The deficit.
Usually, yes. But here's the twist Hudson emphasizes. This deficit became a source of strength.
Because foreign central banks ended up financing it. They had to buy U.S. Treasury bonds with their surplus dollars earned from trade with the U.S. Hudson literally calls America's Cold War spending a tax on foreigners.
So instead of U.S. taxpayers funding the deficit,
foreign central banks were essentially forced to lend the money back to the U.S. government by buying treasuries. Their export earnings flowed right back to finance U.S. spending, including military spending abroad.
Which all built up until the Nixon shock in 1971. The U.S. closes the gold window. What pushed it to that point?
Well, the amount the U.S. owed foreign central banks, its dollar liabilities, had actually exceeded its gold stock back in 1964. The pressure was building. So August 15, 1971, Nixon pulls the plug. No more converting dollars to gold for foreign governments.
And this put Europe and Asia in a terrible bind.
A huge bind. They're holding all these dollars. What do? Option 1, keep holding them, mostly as U.S. Treasury bills.
Yeah.
Option 2, dump them on the market, which would crash the dollar's value and make their own exports way more expensive.
And the U.S. sort of nudged them towards option 1.
Nudged them pretty hard. U.S. diplomats made it clear. Trying to cash in dollars for gold or even using dollars to buy up American companies would be considered unfriendly.
Unfriendly acts. Got it.
Hudson calls it a Machiavellian strategy. The U.S. basically planned to let inflation eat away at the real value of that massive dollar overhang of $75 billion or so owed to foreign central banks.
So pay back the debt with cheaper dollars down the road.
Exactly. Repay with dollars that had less purchasing power. It was, well, quite a move from the U.S. perspective. They basically defaulted on the gold pledge and planned to inflate away the debt.
And part of this was forcing other countries to revalue their currencies upwards against the dollar.
Precisely. The U.S. wanted countries like Japan and Germany to make their currencies stronger relative to the dollar. This makes their exports more expensive and U.S. exports cheaper, helping the U.S. trade balance.
But the U.S. didn't have to officially devalue its own currency. It shifted the adjustment burden.
It shifted the burden entirely onto its trading partners.
Mm.
Very effective if you're the one doing the shifting.
So how did people try to explain this bizarre situation where the world's biggest debtor seemed to be calling the shots?
Well, one theory that emerged was the International Financial Intermediary hypothesis, the IFI hypothesis.
Okay, what did that say?
It tried to frame the U.S. deficit as just a statistical illusion. It said, look, the U.S. is like a giant global bank. It takes in short-term deposits from foreigners, those dollars, and invests them long-term, maybe buying companies overseas or funding government activities.
So it made the U.S. debtor position sound normal, even beneficial.
It basically tried to normalize and legitimize it, suggesting foreign central banks were choosing to invest their dollar surpluses in interest-bearing U.S. treasuries instead of, say, gold. It rationalized this unique, advantageous position the U.S. found itself in.
Right. So now let's dig into the actual mechanisms Hudson identifies for this monetary imperialism and what it meant for everyone else. He talks about an institutionalized double standard.
Yeah, this is really about trade rules. The U.S. pushed hard for things like most favored nation treatment in trade agreements like GOTT, meaning, treat all your trading partners equally.
But did the U.S. follow its own rules?
Hudson argues not consistently. They often used Buy American policies, imposed quotas on things like textiles, protected their own agriculture heavily.
Like the Common Agricultural Policy, the KEAP.
Well, the KEAP was European, but the U.S. had its own massive agricultural supports that distorted trade. And the U.S. wasn't shy about threatening retaliation if other countries didn't go along with its demands.
Which leads to this pretty dramatic phrase Hudson uses, the mad bomber threat. What's that about?
It sounds extreme, but it captures a specific dynamic, Hudson observed, starting around 1968. He says U.S. diplomats were basically willing to act like world wreckers, meaning they'd implicitly or explicitly threaten global financial chaos if foreign central banks stopped buying U.S. treasuries, stopped recycling those dollar inflows back to the U.S. The message was sort of, if you don't keep propping up our system, we might just blow the whole thing up and everyone suffers. It's leveraged through perceived recklessness.
Wow. Playing chicken with the global economy.
You could put it that way.
So looking at the bigger picture, what was the actual cost of all this for other countries, especially developing ones?
The costs were substantial, according to Hudson. Those trillions held in U.S. treasuries by foreign central banks. He calls them forced loans to the U.S. government.
Forced loans.
Yeah, because they didn't really have a choice but to hold those dollars and invest them somewhere, and treasuries were the main option. This effectively transferred resources from their citizens to the U.S. government, financing U.S. deficits. The longer the U.S. ran deficits, the bigger these forced loans became.
And did this impact their ability to develop their own economies?
Hugely. Hudson is very critical of the policies imposed by the IMF and World Bank, the so-called Washington Consensus. Things like forcing privatization, cutting government spending deeply, opening markets perhaps too quickly.
What was the result?
He argues it often led to massive capital flight money pouring out of the country and actively hindered development in debtor nations. It created dependency, not self-sufficiency. He points to Russia after 1991 as a major example. The reforms pushed by U.S. advisors, he claims, led to kleptocracy and huge capital flight, crippling the economy. These policies, he argues, often destabilized governments that tried to implement them.
It sounds like a fundamental imbalance, an asymmetry of influence.
Exactly. The U.S. always prioritizes its own domestic economy and security. Yeah. And critically, it can because its internal market is so huge.
Right. You mentioned foreign trade is a much smaller slice of the U.S. economy compared to Europe, for instance.
Precisely. Foreign trade might be only 5% of U.S. GNP versus 20–25% for many European economies. This gives the U.S. the power to essentially say, play by our rules, or we might just walk away, or break the system, because they can absorb the shock better than most. Hudson argues that until other nations are willing to call that bluff, maybe risk a trade war, the U.S. has little incentive to change its ways or live within its means.
So let's wrap this up. We've explored Michael Hudson's argument in Super-Imperialism, this idea that the U.S. flipped the script on global power, moving from a traditional creditor role to wielding power as a debtor.
Right, fundamentally reshaping global finance and trade in the process. And it wasn't always some grand unified plan, but more the U.S. seizing opportunities, always putting its interests first, and forcing other nations to adapt to a system that, well, primarily benefited the U.S., using not just gold, but what Hudson calls fiat credit, the power of the dollar itself.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? If this system of monetary imperialism depends on other countries basically going along with it to avoid global collapse, what would it actually take for them to stop going along, to say, enough? What would the real cost be? And who would pay it?
And maybe, how does knowing this context change how you read the headlines today? About trade disputes, currency fluctuations, talk of new reserve currencies. Does it make you rethink who really holds the cards in the global economy?
Definitely gives you a different lens to look through. Some serious food for thought there.